Welcome back. Today we are going to take a look at the Oriolus Szalayi. Hey, I have no idea how to pronounce it, so I will avoid trying to do so. But this is what it looks like up close. So very, very nice looking blue shells, named after a brown bird. Blue shells, nice sparkly faceplates. Cable is actually quite nice. The important parts are inside. This one is the tri-brid, so dynamic driver for the base, planar for the middle, and balanced armature for the top. So quite nice, quite unique. And I think the second thing that people notice about this set is the graph. And please don't be blinded by the bass curve. There's more to it than that. But I think I graphed it. There's about two other graphs. And I think mine is almost at the top-ish range. Hawaii Bad Boys was a little bit lower, and there was one right in the middle. So I'm not sure exactly which one is dead on right according to the manufacturer graph, but without a doubt, there is a big bass curve. Also to notice that this one actually pops up above 2K, so there's a little bit of in-your-faceness going on there. It's got kind of also a treble level that isn't all that relaxed. It kind of stays up there for quite a bit, and then it kind of levels off into safe territory. But yeah, there's a little bit more to it than just the bass, and how the planar hits the mids and the upper treble and all that is things that we will talk about right about now. So what do you need to know about this one? Like I said, unique hybrid, planar, dynamic driver, balanced armature. Definitely a lot of serious fun, but it also comes at a serious price, so it's about $900. And I will say their marketing is mostly on point. And if you go to their website and look at their little couple paragraphs on this set, they actually mention vocals 3 times. And I think that's right on. I think that was their emphasis on the tuning, and I think that part comes through right on the planar, right into the vocals. They are very much forward, and it's kind of hard to miss them. And you can be blinded by the bass curve and look at it and say it's a basshead, but no, it's actually, they were right on saying that the vocals were kind of right there as the most important bit. They also mentioned detail, and I think this one is sort of where they were trying to work in the planar driver, and they mentioned it twice, and I think this one's a little bit less obvious because, one, there's a big bass curve, and there's a treble level that's not all that boosted. So I think the detail is sort of there. It's just a little bit harder to hear, but it is sort of nicely revealed. But between the bass and the treble, you get some nice details. And then kind of lastly, they talk about this immersive timbre, energies, and deep stage. And I do like kind of the fun sound to it, and there's an energy to it. But the deep stage, I think, is a little bit harder, and it goes back to, this little bit here. I think it's a little harder to pull off a deep stage with that rising a little as early as it did, and maybe as high as it did. Not always you are going to hear that a little bit too forward. It's going to, only when your tracks really hit it. Otherwise, it kind of sounds, you can get a deeper stage, but probably not as much as maybe they were thinking, or maybe they tuned it to some other music, which is a little more emphasizing the deep stage to it. So is it a bass headset? I will say maybe it's a conservative bass headset. It's actually less bassy than you would imagine, and that's why I pointed out the 3 different bass curves. And if you look at it on Squig, like mine doesn't sound like it's 15 dB. It's definitely boosted, but I would say mine is somewhere between HBB's was maybe a bit lower. Whoever was right in the middle is probably closer to what it sounds like in your ear. So I wouldn't call it a major bass headset. I would call it a conservative minor bass headset. But my first listen instinct was it does have really hard bass hits, but they tend to be mostly behind the vocals, more like a fun set with a lot of bass. And I wouldn't call it Basshead, as it's not really the primary characteristic. Again, I think when they talk about vocals, I think that was what their intention was, and I think that's what comes across to me as well. So on the bass, I do think on a random track, not really a bass-heavy track, it does sound more like a smaller dynamic driver. And if you look at the 6mm and the 8mm, and they have these big bass curves like that, and then you listen to them in your ear, and it sounds more like a lower 10mm dynamic driver, that's kind of the way this one hits me. And that's why when I graphed it, I immediately thought that they had a 8mm inside of it, and I went and looked at their website just to see, and it's actually a 10mm. But I think the way it sounds and the way it's angled and the response that it does, especially the way it drops down really fast, it doesn't sound as big as it looks. And I would have sworn it was an 8mm. Just looking at the graph and how it sounds, it has that combination of graphing really high but not being as big in ear. So that was kind of surprising. But there is a lot of control and restraint and definition to it. It's done very, very well. I think Oriolus has a history of doing bass very, very well, dynamic drivers very well. I think this is, right there, up there with them. And if you do have to plug it in. It does need a little bit more power. It does get tighter. I think all that is done pretty well. And at this price point, I think they're assuming you have some pretty nice gear. But I thought it was going to be a bass monster, and it can go there in the sub bass, but the mid bass really isn't all that huge. Again, the vocals are the important bit here, and on random tracks, it mostly sounds like a fuller bass, maybe a U-shape. It's kind of right there in the middle of the two, and there's just less bleed than you're kind of expecting. If you want to hear it overstep, kind of along the curve that you're expecting, I think some grunge like Nirvana or Soundgarden. I thought Spoonman was the first one I noticed that was, it was kind of a lot. Nirvana, I was listening to In Utero because I think they just re-released that one, so that one wasn't. Both of those sort of hit the area where it starts to rise a little bit quicker. If you're down in here, it's actually not that bad. If you look at this bit, that's only about 5 dB. So compared to other sets right here, kind of in the mid bass, it's not all that hard, but it rises pretty fast as you get into the sub bass. So as your tracks hit more out there in the sub bass, you tend to notice a bit more. But a track like Filters, Take a Picture, I think that one was sufficiently thumpy. And his voice actually sounds pretty great because he's a male singer, and it sounds pretty well on that bass curve. Mids, and this is where you're expecting the planar airiness to happen, and I think it does quite well. There's a lot of focus on the mids and the upper mids, and where you hear the planar shine over the bass. My first thought was that it's not as planar tech as it sounds, but I mean the weird thing about it is it literally sounds like the planar is in front of the dynamic driver. And you have to hear the two almost separately to hear the planar come through. If the bass is trying to come through over the planar, it's a little bit harder to hear some of the technicals on it. But if you can get those to quiet down and you just listen to the mids, and then I think everything, you sort of get that there's a planar there and it actually sounds pretty well. But as soon as on busier tracks, I think it sounds a little less detailed. But the way it slots between a dynamic driver and a balanced armature is kind of unique. The way it slots between two planars, I think is how I said it, but it can take on a more natural planar sound, which had me a little hooked. Just because I haven't heard it before, I think it was really, really quite cool that they put a dynamic driver, even though planars can do bass very, very well. I think it was kind of interesting the way they hooked those two together. The way the balanced armature, it's kind of an iffy thing, and we'll talk about that in a second, but again, I would probably buy it for the mids and not so much that bass curve. I think male vocals, they're really quite nice. I mean, Peter Gabriel's Sledgehammer, I think Billy Joel's Innocent Man, those parts of male vocals that sound really lean on Harman sets, and they're not super, super thick on this set. Again, it's kind of a U-shaped thing, but when they sort of hit the male vocals, I think it's noticeable, and I think those two guys actually sound pretty well. Female vocals, just a little bit harder, and I would say finding the ones that were in the sweet spot. It's definitely not Madonna. Kim Wilde's Kids in America, very cool track. Her edginess of her voice and where it is and where it sits, I think was actually pretty okay. I think Haley Seinfeld's Love Myself, it kind of sounds better. Something about her voice and where it sits on that curve. It stages better, and it's a lot of proper fun. But more energetic sets tend to be a little bit in your face-ish, and I think you got to be really, they call them energies, but where tracks tend to hit some of these bigger peaks, it's kind of hard to deal with. Female vocals, sometimes you would hear them, like Madonna was kind of fell back a little bit. Haley Seinfeld was kind of right there. Kim Wilde was sort of right, kind of a little bit off center, but it sounded actually pretty good. But yeah, it's really hard to find a match on the females, whereas the male vocals, I think, generally sounded about right. But more energetic tracks definitely tend to hit the inner face zone, and that tended to bother me after a while. Treble, just like the third wheel here, I think it's where the bass and the mids are very strong characters, and then you get the treble, the one balanced armature, and it's kind of like the third wheel. It's not quite on par with the other two. It's there. It just takes a back seat to the vocals and the bass. And I think the marketing team talks about extension. But again, you got to really find the right tracks to hear that extension. I think Michael Jackson's Billie Jean is one that people point to. And I think, again, a little too much energy, a little too in your face, kind of hard to really hear the micro details. But then when you slow things down and bring them down to, a more reasonable, relaxed level, something like Sting's Englishman in New York, I think it just fits better. It stages better, and without the over energy of Michael Jackson's Billie Jean, I think that style actually worked out really well for me. And I think just generally, again, I will say the bass curve is tempting to go dive after that, but a lot of tracks like Sting's, that one I think really hits this set really, really well. And I like that energy level on it. I didn't like the overabundance of energy because it got too in your face, and that kind of turned me off on the stage. So if you work around the energies, like I was just talking about, it stages better. There are times where it sounds, an upper mid-fi stage. It sounds, immersive and behind your head, and it actually stages kind of well. Then there's just other times where it really flattens out, like Michael Jackson's Billie Jean, and the whole thing kind of smashes in your face. And that wasn't as attractive. So if you pick and choose, or you had a library that really sat well with it, I think you could do really, really well. I mean, it's without a doubt, it's a very, very fun set. I wouldn't call it a fun set for every person, but generally it is a very fun, and I'm very thankful that a generous man named John sent this one to me. So thank you again for tuning in, and I will see you next time.